Instead of breaking, the egg launched from the back of a small car, loaded, 2 men in its front, 3 at its back, missed me, praised my opened legs, my skirt that sent the egg towards the floor to do its breaking there, praised my head and its quickness, a clean fold towards my lap to dodge the second egg, faster than the first, rising to see the damage, spoke the words, "Not today, Lord, not today." The back of the bus stop, a new target, not my face. Should have stood up and ran into the dark, screamed, cried, asked why. Instead, laughed, told no one, made excuses, said it was dark, said it was only a game. Prayers being left stainless. Mother would have noticed otherwise, would have said, "That's it. Close my door. You're never going out again." Thank you. I call that poem Halloween because it's the time of year that this incident happened. And also because I think it helps to blame Halloween and not my blackness or my hijab or anything about me specifically. And I wrote this poem quite recently, but it actually happened a year ago. So I do what's convenient mostly, which is to forget things or places or people or things that have hurt me. And there are whole countries and territories that have shaped me directly or indirectly that I've also conveniently forgotten about. And not that long ago, I was featured in a Guardian article, and I promised myself that I wouldn't read those comments. And one of the first things that I did read was, "Shame someone that was born in Denmark calls themselves Somali." And after the initial defensiveness, the "you don't know me" and my story, and "how dare you question what I choose to call myself," I found myself asking, how did you forget the first 8 years of living there? And I remember taking someone's portrait, and we were walking and talking, and somehow places of our birth came up, and when I said where I was born, there was this surprise and shock, like I had been hiding it, and that it mattered. And then came the question, well, have you written about it? And I hadn't. And I recognize now an anger at not belonging in only one place, at calling myself only Somali when I had never been to the country, when I felt like I was losing the language, and also when the elder members of my family just didn't recognize me. So I suspect it is why I do what I do. I'm a documenter, or you can call it snooping on my parents and their really loud conversations back home and trying to find some beauty within that. Or you can call it digging, being nosy, getting to the bottom of things, or trying to. I'm a poet, which is a hard label when I'm not, actively writing, which is a story these days, unfortunately. And I'm also a photographer, which is also a hard label when I'm not holding a camera in someone's face, or I'm not working on a photography series. But it just is simpler for me to call myself a storyteller. And it's simple because for me, it just means I have more than one medium, and that if one falls short of what I need from it, then I have another at my disposal that might do the job better. Writing is what I did when we first moved to London from Denmark 14 years ago now. And I made things up. I borrowed other people's stories, I wrote myself into them, and they were about me too, but I protected myself in that way. I created a distance. So if anybody asked, that character or that voice couldn't have been me, because I was only a little Somali girl from West London who even really knew I existed. And it couldn't have been me because I was writing about things that I was supposedly too young to understand. I'm the eldest daughter of Somali parents, and most of my family live in Kenya, particularly Nairobi, also Mombasa and Mandera. And going to Kenya for the first time was so bizarre because I was meeting all these family members for the first time. And some I knew by face, kind of, because their pictures had been sent over. And some of you might know the type of picture I'm talking about, the ones with the scenic backdrop and the artificial flowers. Oh yeah, with the artificial flowers, we got a lot of waterfalls. And some I also knew by voice because they had called really early in the morning looking for my parents. But I've never been able to pin myself to any place at all. And when I say that phrase, pin myself, I kind of always just imagine someone like holding me against a map and shouting, tell me where you're from now. And to simplify all of that and to make it just much, much easier, I say, I'm just Somali. But how do I explain the feeling of guilt when I left Kenya and I left all these family members behind, knowing I probably wouldn't be back in a long, long time, or maybe even not at all? And how do I explain the feeling of shame that time we were stopped by officials in Copenhagen airport? They assumed our passports were fake. I had forgotten Danish. I'd forgotten Danish, and I was deeply, deeply emotional, and I didn't understand why. Did it tell me something about myself? Was I convinced that I was Danish before the incident? And was I something else after it? And before then, we were standing in line at the grocery store, and I must have just glanced over at the newspaper stand, and the one in the middle had Somali in the title. And so I asked my cousin to translate, and I don't remember exactly what it said now, but it must have been something about us flooding their country, or looking desperate, or being criminals. And I think it underlines something really specific for me, which is that I, my family, people that looked like me were unwanted and didn't belong. And I think that's why I haven't written about Denmark. My small act of defiance to reject what is rejecting me. And poetry for me means being completely honest about my vulnerabilities, my weaknesses, everything that I don't want people to see. And when I was in Kenya for the 6 weeks and I couldn't write anything, I had to find a way to preserve the memories and also to preserve these people who were strangers but weren't really strangers but were my family. And I had to find a way to remember them and also to bring something back to remember them by. And there were so many problems with that idea because everyone I encountered just distrusted the camera. Perhaps because they had only just met me and didn't trust me to capture them. Perhaps because they know how wide and fast photographs travel. Perhaps because to the people in a different continent, it would be the only representation of them they'd have. And would they be able to dispute the photograph? Like, could they call and say, actually, that's not me, she's lying. And I remember meeting my aunt for the first time, my aunt who raised my mum. And I remember my fear just being that we wouldn't be able to establish a closeness and a warmth between us because of my really weak Somali. And I just knew I had to try my hardest to take pictures of everything that I could. And I don't know when it happened or how it happened, but I lost a majority of the pictures I took while in Kenya. And some family portraits were left, thank God. But mostly I was left with pictures of the sea. And no matter how beautiful the ocean and the beaches were, or are, I mourned the loss of those pictures for a really, really long time. And before that, it was just flat out denial, like I couldn't have lost those pictures, like they have to be somewhere. And then later on, it was maybe I imagined taking them. Maybe like they just, I just didn't take them. And the one I constantly think about, because it was one of the lost ones, and because I don't want to lose its composition in my head, is one where my mum is laying in her old bed, and it's the bed that she slept in as a young girl, and the one that she left behind when she married my father and they moved to Denmark. And I don't know if there was something wrong with my camera, or I just wanted to extend the moment because I felt at peace, but I stood there until I heard her say, "Are you done? Did you get your picture?" And sitting next to my aunt and taking photographs of her, I started to think about photographs as a language all on their own. And I thought, I should let these photos live as they want without imposing my words or my will. And so there's a picture of my aunt where she's like sitting and she's sipping her tea. I'm just sitting next to her. And so when I took that picture, I thought, we're just going to take this photo for what it is. And this cup that she's holding in her hand isn't going to be a metaphor for something else, nor is her sipping this tea, nor is her look into the distance. And when I was looking at that photo, yeah, that one. And when I was looking at that photo, I also just thought, what happens when I completely do lose the language that we need to understand each other with? Like, what connects us and makes us relate beyond blood? And now looking at this picture, I'm also thinking of all that's left unspoken. So the very first few months in London, and the English classes away from the other children, and the loneliness, and the accident that occurred on the playground that led me to sit in front of the school nurse. And she asked if I spoke English, and I remember understanding enough to nod no. But it's always her huffing and her puffing, I remember, and her disregard for the fear that I felt, and her laugh to another colleague while I sat in the chair holding a tissue to a bloody nose. And then fast forward to me sitting in a citizenship class, and I'm being asked, "So, do you feel British?" And when I say, "Nope, absolutely not," my teacher was so taken aback by my outburst. She was like, "Wait a minute, but your accent, you speak so well." Firstly, side-eye at that comment. But my fear is the revoking of the passport, because the Danish passport didn't save me from interrogation at a Danish airport, and because the only thing British or English or London about me, to me anyway, is my accent. And for a really long time, I was obsessed with these videos where people would wake up and they'd completely lose their accent and their dialect and their language, and I kind of just sat around and expected that to happen to me too. Every memory is attached to another memory. So I'm thinking of meeting my grandfather for the first time while in Kenya, my last surviving grandparent, and remember walking into his room, and there was a radio right by his bedside, and it was playing a Somali poem, and we call it a gabe. And my dad pointed at it and he said, "Look, like it runs in the family." But there was a language barrier. I didn't understand my grandfather and he didn't understand me. So my father agreed to translate. My two questions: number one, how old do you think you are? And number two, where are all the photos and the photo albums? And after a brief exchange, my dad says to me, around 80, and they're all gone. And I remember being really teary-eyed because I wanted to find some way to go back and to bring those photo albums here. And it's so naive, but the hope was that maybe then there wouldn't be a need to talk. Maybe the photos themselves would be enough of an explanation about where he'd been and who he'd been and how much he'd been changed. And also, I just left his room really sad every time at having gotten so close to him, but only being able to say, "Salam, peace be upon you." I felt changed when I returned from Kenya. I was heavier. I had more stories than I knew what to do with, and I didn't have enough words or not the right ones. I had a better understanding. I witnessed the dysfunction, the silences up close, also the familiarity, and my mum's oldest brother sitting right next to her and saying her name again and again and again, and saying, "I thought I'd never see you in this life again." And so my aunt sitting next to me and saying, "Listen, now that you made it here, don't become a stranger again." And because London is sometimes lonely and because hardly anyone ever comes to visit, I just witnessed another way to live. And I think sometimes we go through this world just in battle with the way people view us, and also the way that we view ourselves in relation to that. And along the way of my nearly 22 years of existence, I've discovered ways of healing myself that didn't require me to have a lot of money. So I had a pen and I had a notebook, and I also converted the family camera into my own. And before there was ever a camera, I used my phone. And now, for me, I find it useful to find ways to belong in places that make it hard to do so, and just to note how I've been shaped or changed by these experiences in these places. And I also recognize that it's very possible to find home and community in places despite feeling very unsafe at the same time. And I also recognize now how documenting has kept me upright and sane. And I think the poems that I struggled to write and the ones that I still carry within me that haven't made it onto a page yet, I think they show me where I've been and how I'm still surviving. And I hope that the photographs will do that too. Thank you.